Welcome to this first episode of the annual journey of the Mandala of Service, which opens with the exploration of the social and political field, which we will explore under the sign of Aries, a fire sign, and the first zodiac sign, which determines the Spring Equinox and begins a new annual cycle. When we think of Aries people, we think of bold, confident, and fearless people getting what they want. This strength is empowered by its traditional ruler, Mars, the planet of courage and dynamism. At a soul level, Aries is ruled by Mercury, and it represents Aries' purpose at a deeper level. The service field of politics is described by the teachings of ancient wisdom as animated by practitioners who will concern themselves with the political factors of each nation, who will work in the field of human government, will deal with the problems of civilization and relations between nations, and that beyond that, they will aim at understanding between peoples. My name is Lorraine Flower. I'm with the Community of Living Ethics in Umbria, Italy, and I will be your guide through this session where we have invited Marco Toscano, an expert in international cooperation, to be our guest for this episode, as with his help and experience, we explore this field of politics. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorraine. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you here with us today. I'd like to start, first of all, with a very general question, and that's to ask you what you think of the word service. What does it mean to you when you reflect on this word?
Certainly, service is something that you do for others, but is an others that needs to include also you, because is an action in the interest of the wholeness. So it's an action that cannot leave anything or anybody out. And in that sense, it requires really our understanding on how to commensurate our own needs with the needs of others in order to find the new formulas that can integrate them all.
Wonderful. So when we're thinking about that idea of being of service to ourselves, but also being of service to others, and to bring that together, if we bring that then into the field of politics, in these days, in these times and years, politics isn't generally seen as having a positive impact on society. And in some cases, we're seeing extremes in political thinking and amongst political players. In your experience, what does it mean to turn a political action into a service action?
Well, actually, first, let me really thank you for inviting me to be here today on discussing on this with the inputs that we have received from the sky. I think that today you're really conducting an incredibly interesting experiment, which is fundamentally about broadening our understanding through the use of knowledge from different fields, sometimes even unusual fields. And I would certainly say that the current complexity of life requires of us an implicit form of humility and openness to any type of knowledge that we do not necessarily need to believe in, but at least to experiment. And in that sense, I think that politics is service, as simple as that.
That's interesting, isn't it? That politics is service, and as you say, the being open to knowledge, being open to other inspirations, and other. Might we say the word energies that might be playing on us at this point in time. So if we think about politics actually being service, when you kind of expand that into a vision, what could you share with us as perhaps some ideas or images that might give people more of a sense of politics as as a service? Because I would have to say that in these days, it can be quite hard to see that relationship. We know it should be in service, but quite often it doesn't feel that way. So how could we elevate that vision for people?
Well, tough question. Let me give it a try. As I was mentioning, I think that politics is service. And it is perhaps one of the most complex forms of service, but of which we have seen really shining examples in history in all cultures. So it is possible. It is certainly connected to the use of power, and in particular to the ability to decide, to make decisions that are in the interest of the group. Now, the question is, which group? In a globalized world, this implies the ability to take into account an increasing numbers of variables and growing needs without leaving anyone excluded or behind. The group, therefore, and just to answer this rhetorical question, is humanity, whose interest, however, cannot be disconnected from the interests of other kingdoms of nature, under the penalty of self-destruction, really, if we don't do that. In that sense, I feel that powers requires, on the part of those who exercise it, a constant reflections on how to exercise it in favor of a common good, which is itself in constant transformation. And it changes with the change in people's state of consciousness. So we're dealing with something that is in constant evolution, but needs to be nurtured in these evolutions, and we need to sail through and with that evolution. Otherwise, we get stuck and we don't go forward. And I can give you a very tangible example of this. And for instance, the development of environmental policies over the last 50 years, and not least the adoptions by the United Nations of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on climate change. And maybe other important examples can be the adoption of gender equality, non-discrimination policies. In this sense, the paradigm of international human rights law is certainly a milestone in history of humanity. Maybe if I may add, certainly we have seen that globalization also evokes many fears, anxieties, which I believe are very natural, but whose related effects and behaviors can be very problematic. It is therefore essential, I guess, to work hard to bring to light and address these fears, which are linked more often than not, or among others, to the themes of identity and survival. So we really need to look into this question deeply, beyond just geopolitical considerations. And I guess that politics changes as we change as human beings, as individuals, as citizens, with our choices and with our questions, and most fundamentally through our demands.
Marco, thank you. You've brought many important factors in with what you've just shared there. And you mentioned the word power, and with that, some of the fear, maybe loss of control that comes with globalization, because we're talking about something on a large scale. And you gave some wonderful examples of where humanity has cooperated, collaborated, brought its thinking together to see a larger vision. But that is a real challenge, isn't it, for many of us, to lift our thinking, to lift our sights, our vision, to something that is bigger than our immediate needs and selfish needs, perhaps, not in any judgmental sense, but we're all human and we focus on what's close to us. Do you have a sense, as you relate to this idea of expanding our consciousness, could you share with us what you think is helping humanity to lift itself into this broader, more global consideration of the other, and how we might maybe even reflect on that more in our own individual lives and maybe come to a different relationship with this word politics?
Well, certainly, Lorraine, I think that this is a challenge for all of us. No one is excluded. And I think it's very important. There is an element of humility there. I think that everybody is challenged by this, excuse me for the double use of words, by these challenges. And I guess that certainly the ability to think creatively is much less obvious than one, again, sorry for playing with words, than one may think. It is important to become increasingly aware of our fears, our inhibitions, and our prejudices. That's fundamental. At the same time, I guess, and this is also touching on something that you said earlier in terms of fear and the difficulty of the times, I really believe that this is something that can be done even in extremely dark and troubling times. And I give you an example. When I was studying at a university, I was really impressed by a series of leaflets that were published around, I guess, like 41, 42, also 43. Therefore, in really dark years of World War II, which were indeed already imagining and planning what should have happened for the better after and beyond the end of World War II. I was really, really impressed by the strength of mind that these people surely had and the strength of consciousness that they had in order not to be discouraged by the terrifying reality that certainly was surrounding them. And maybe an important element of this architecture that they were thinking in difficult times, in times when even the vast majority of the things they were considering the League of Nations a failure. Despite of that, these people were conceiving an even better organization. And in fact, this, as part of this architecture that they were imagining, that was the creation of the United Nations, the UN. And I guess that the UN is certainly an experiment, which is still in progress, and certainly it has many difficulties, as we can see it on a daily basis. However, at the same time, I guess that is also an incredible experiment in developing the human capacity to collectively decide for the common good and to constantly imagine this common good in its constant evolution. It's a little bit touching upon some of the aspects that I mentioned earlier. And I think that a good example, again, is international human rights law, the Sustainable Development Goals, decolonizations, and etc. But we need to be committed ourselves to learn to think better and better. We think every day, and we think that thinking is easy and normal. Well, it's not. It's like, as you learn to cook, as you learn to swim, as you learn to do anything, we should be humble enough to understand that we need to learn to think throughout our entire life.
This again has brought forward some very important principles for me, I think, as we're exploring this field of politics, because I think quite often when certainly I've been involved in conversations about politics with family members, group members, people in general, there's a tendency to consider politics as something that is happening amongst politicians and amongst governments and amongst institutional bodies such as the UN. And of course it is happening there, and that is the organized field of politics. And yet my sense increasingly, and also sparked by what you're saying, is that each one of us is involved in the field of politics. We are politics, we are policy, we are part of the fabric of society. And how we show up in our own lives affects the political thinking and political climate. And so I heard you inviting us to, in a sense, take up our place in that field of politics by opening our vision, by opening our sense of what will come beyond some of these darker times or challenges. And this process of thinking is obviously very, very important. As an individual, what would you be encouraging me to be doing and thinking so that I can be taking my place in this larger field of politics?
Another tough one.
Sorry, Marco, I want to get full value.
I think what you said earlier is very important in the sense that we have to admit that there are many fields of lives that are complex, but the very same fact that there are many, it makes, of course, a little difficult for each single human being to understand everything. Hence the value of working as a group. Then I guess that at the same time it's important to always retain a little bit of ownership. So yes, there are politicians that are experts in certain topics, they're expert in the machinery, they are expert in certain processes. But at the same time, as we do in medicine with the doctors or whenever we have an issue, we don't delegate 100% to the experts. We need to retain our sense of guiding, and then we work with the experts to help us take us where we want to be. If we delegate to others what is wanted, then we've got to accept that things may go differently from what we may expect. But let me elaborate a little bit more on this. I think that to achieve that, a fundamental step really consists in our, ability to look beyond our interest, to try to better grasp the interest of needs of others, and where to find formulas that integrate them. A kind of progressive synthesis, so step by step. And this is work in progress. Nobody is an expert on that. It's like being in constant training, and we have to retain this humility of being in constant training. And this really implies a constant willingness, determination, firmness, perseverance to train ourselves to cooperate. From the smallest issues, and maybe that's easiest to learn a bit, but then of course also for the most or more complex things. I guess that in a very pragmatic terms, it also requires that us, for instance, in times of elections as citizens, to ask candidates across the political spectrum very clearly what they intend to do for, the environment, for climate change, for the respect of human rights, discriminations, international cooperation. Very, very simple question. And let me elaborate a little bit more on this question of cooperation and international cooperations. I guess that international cooperation needs to be expanded, and it has to be cooperation for development. The world has seen millennia of military alliances. I think that we need to look at the future where we have alliances for cooperation for development. And I don't think that we can derogate from the need of international cooperation for development. At the same time, I guess, it is also necessary to address the issue of cooperation within our nations. So not only between nations, within. Because within, there is little talk about cooperations and maybe too much talk about balancing between opposing forces and finding temporary equilibrium or equilibristics. And it's like we need to do more domestically and speak more about what it entails to cooperate within a nation. And I guess, moving back to the question of international cooperation, I think we should not underestimate the fact that international cooperation for development is a very recent thing in the history of humanity. It practically took hold 77 years ago with the creation of the United Nations. So if you look at the broad spectrum of human lives over millennia, 77 years is just the super very beginning. Of course, it's a very complex field of human endeavor. And if we see it on a planetary scale, it will certainly require a prolonged commitment in the time to come, because we are really at the very beginning. And because we are at the very beginning, I guess that we must maintain the enthusiasm that is necessary for great endeavors. We cannot just be pessimistic when we witness some failures. At the beginning, it always happens. Let's try to remember when we're learning how to walk. How many times have we fallen, right? But I guess that I believe that, and this, I guess, is a fundamental piece, really, that we must learn more and more to choose, not by voting and by identifying majorities, but by consensus. It is certainly a very long and challenging way, but at the same time, there are already encouraging signs of feasibility in that sense. Within the UN, for example, within the United Nations, many important results, such as the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, have been achieved precisely through consensus. So it's doable.
Thank you, Marco. Again, you've given us many seeds there to reflect on, and certainly this factor of time, because again, as humans, we see things in a very immediate sense, but maybe don't sometimes step back enough to see things in a broader context. And as you say, international cooperation is very much in its infancy in real terms, and therefore some patience and humility is needed. And yet also we see in these times that we're being trained a little bit in this, I think, at an individual level as well, as we domestically, literally in our own families and maybe in our own nations, have the opportunity to debate more and more some of these very important topics. And we know in the UK recently there's been furious debate over the last few years about should we be part of Europe on an economic level or not. That brought a lot of discussion into family homes and friendship groups and so on. And I guess what I'm saying is we're being trained, we're being given the opportunity to learn how to come into a new point of cooperation in our thinking and therefore in the solutions. As we close here today, and I know we could go on for many more hours because of the themes that are coming up here, but as we close our discussion here today, I wonder if you're able to leave our listeners with one suggestion, one step, one thing that you'd like to underline very synthetically, that they can take away and apply in their own lives.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think a small prelude. I think that the challenge or a challenge of politics is the short-term thinking, and we need to have a much longer-term thinking in politics beyond the mandates, and then we need the short-term thinking, which is more related on how to make things happen. So forging the vision and realizing it. This is the dual poles around which politics needs to revolve. So not short-term objectives, long-term objectives, and work hard to materialize in them with perseverance beyond the mandates of MPs, of governments, and you name it. So maybe what I would like to leave with me, with you, out of this very stimulating conversation is that It's we have to be committed for the long run. So it needs really our strong determination. It is doable. There is no doubt about that. But we also have to be conscious about the important homework that we have to do as individuals, because the collective will not get better if I don't get better as an individual.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you. Yes. So we all can take away from this that commitment to lift our heads up, lift our sights up, get involved, get better in our thinking, get longer term in our thinking, and to hold that vision for international cooperation and a true one humanity. So I'd love to say a huge thank you on behalf of our listeners, and thank you for being part of this first podcast as we begin our journey in the Mandala of Service. On behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank Marco for his time today, and we will see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for having me.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you.
A great pleasure.
This podcast was offered by the Community of Living Ethics, Umbria, Italy, and freely inspired by Aldebaran, the community's Astrosophy group, and by our research on service.